Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love, Shamika Michelle, and Wilfred Riley.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love alongside my co-host Wilfred Riley. And our guests this week are Winkfield Twyman Jr. and Jennifer Richmond, authors of the new book, Letters in Black and White, a new correspondence on race in America. It's a little bright. Got to get it out the light. Get it out the light. You got one back there. I have less light. Jennifer, hold that up.
Let's see.
Let everybody see
Let's
it.
lose Jennifer's. There you go.
Buy a couple copies of this. See, I got too much light in front of me. Jennifer and Winkfield, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, it's good to have you talking about the book here. It's about race. All right. So people may be like, not again. But it's not our fault. It's in the news all the time. So as long as people are talking about it, we should talk about it. I think Will even had a copy. I saw it moved over there. But
it's back here in the house, yeah.
But
okay.
What you do in this correspondence on race is very unique, really an amazing thing that you decided to do, whether you agree with it or not. I think everyone can learn from it. But what it is, it's truly, you're not just calling it a correspondence, it truly is one. You two wrote letters. I don't know if you actually wrote them in black and white, but back and forth, having conversations about race. So talk about how you came up with the idea, how you found each other, and let's start there and get into the topic.
Jen, that's your cue, I think.
Okay. So Charles, I am in Austin, Texas, and I started looking how this all started for me was I started looking at polarization and why America is being pulled apart. And as part of that exercise, I started to seek out people who thought differently than me to learn more. And as I got into this, I'm a China scholar, so this American history is not really my forte. As I got into this, I realized that race was one of the biggest polarizing factors. And at this time, this is pre-George Floyd. The city of Austin had a diversity training program, and I went in with my whole heart, thinking that I was going to learn about experiences that aren't my own and be a better person from it. And I ended up leaving there. It was 2 days of how bad whiteness is and what is wrong with whiteness. We had to do a whiteness score and line up with our whiteness scores. And I was so shocked by something that I approached with such interest and curiosity. I wrote about it. And so it was Diversity Dropout. It was published in Aereo magazine. And the next day I get an email from an unknown person asking me all these very open questions about race. And we just started going back and forth. And about 3 months, literally pages almost every day. And about 3 months in, I said, this is a novel conversation and we've had a lot to say. I wonder if anyone would be interested in reading it along with us. So that's how the conversation started.
Yeah. And from my end, Charles, the moment I read her essay, I was primed to communicate because in my own home, I live amongst a lot of racial dogma, shall we say. There's a lot of mass conformity about how one thinks about race. And I remember one particular conversation with a young relative, and the young relative proclaimed one day, April 21st, 2018, "Blackness is oppression. Nothing else matters." And I was absolutely floored. In fact, I wrote it down somewhere to remember it forever, that date and that quote, because I grew up in a southern suburb, Charles, in the 1970s. And even though we were closer to Jim Crow and closer in time to American slavery, I never, ever had a teacher or a classmate say such a thing. And even my grandma, who was born in 1897, used to babysit me, and her grandfather was a slave. I never heard the word oppression from my grandma's lips, a woman who lived to be 87 years old, in Richmond, Virginia, mind you, the capital of the Confederacy. So I just thought there was a total break between that statement, blackness is oppression, nothing else matters, and reality. And so I felt compelled to talk to someone about that. And Jen became, in a sense, my therapist, if you will, my racial therapist, because ironically, she was also searching for a real conversation or a different conversation about race that was beyond caricatures and stereotypes. And so that's how I got involved in the correspondence. And I'm very glad I did, Charles, because I grew over the course of 4 years. No question about that.
I'll ask you one follow-up question, then go to Will. Obviously, there's a lot of talk about race. I mean, the timing could be part of it with what you were going on with your families and friends and hearing those things. There's a lot of talk, a lot of articles. What was different about what she wrote that made you respond to that article and not the others?
Since I was a little kid in Chester, Virginia, I can remember living in a suburb. And my sense was always that part of being Black was that you would do your best to challenge and confront caricatures and stereotypes. That's part of what defined Blackness in the 1970s in my southern suburb. And so when I read those words in Jen's essay about caricatures and stereotypes in her training, I thought, yep, that resonates with me totally. Although the race is flipped. She's talking about whiteness as a caricature. And I remember the prime directive being to always live against Blackness and caricatures of Blackness and stereotypes of Blackness, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Jennifer, are you drinking pickle juice, Jennifer? What is that you're drinking?
You know what? It's kombucha with a lime in it.
Jen thinks this is Hold My Drink podcast.
But it's not even a. It's not.
Moonshine. Are we doing some stereotypes here? Oh my God! And then
She's
I was
from
going
Texas,
to Will.
right?
I don't know.
Is that a dry or wet state, Jen? I can't remember. Don't remember. But
can you hear me, Will?
Can I hear you?
Oh yeah.
Oh, I can hear you. I can hear that
for some
voice.
reason the video went out on
Oh
my,
yeah, I thought
on
you
my
were gone.
end. Yeah, no, here I am.
Oh yeah, go ahead,
you have the curse of Wink, Will. You have the curse of
Must have
Wink.
been
I
that
tell
pickle juice.
Jen.
Go ahead.
80%
Will.
of the time, I'm like, will my camera hold steady? Will it survive this podcast? So, but he's back.
Mine normally works pretty well. I've been in these Zoom meetings all day. I think this is the first issue we've had with any of them. But yeah, I mean, this isn't normally. There are a lot of things that we debate back and forth about with the guests. I mean, in this case, I think it's more kind of a question of friendly interrogation, like what's going on with the book. So, I mean, in terms of what Charles just said, changing perspectives on race over time or on America over time, what do you guys see as the most meaningful of these letters? I mean, what really speaks to you as you read back through your own book?
Oh, can I jump in, Jen? Then you can jump in?
Yeah.
That's a great question, Will. There are two letters that come to mind. I mean, there are many, many, many letters, but one letter that comes to mind would be the idea that for some reason, current day poverty and crime is caused by long ago American slavery. And I really pushed back against the idea in some of the letters, particularly one letter where I contrasted, the need for us to think about ourselves as old Americans and the need to kind of put aside the worst in our past, but to bring forward the best in our past to the present. And a second letter that really resonated with me was Jack and Jill. Jack and Jill.
Oh,
I remember my dear cousin, Bruce Twyman, the last time I saw him in Richmond, Virginia, it was, I think, the year 2016. He was ill at the time, but we met in Midlothian at a Marriott. And the first words I said to him was, Bruce, I never knew how integral things like Jack and Jill are to some people. Because I had grown up totally oblivious to such things as Jack and Jill, Alpha Kappa Alpha, Alpha Phi Alpha, the Belay, Kappa Alpha Psi, Omega Psi.
Yeah.
There's a whole universe. And so when you get married, you don't really have an idea that that's going to be a central part of how your kids are raised. But after 20 years, I thought, oh my eyes were opened. And I remember telling that to my cousin Bruce. I never knew how important race is for some Black people, because it really was not that important for my mom. We talk in the book about the fact that there's a chasm in Black American psychology. 76% of Black Americans view race, Blackness as extremely important or very important to their sense of self. But then there's 24% that view Blackness as of no value or little value. Man, I grew up in the 24%. And I think my wife grew up in the 76%. And so that letter kind of represents the merging of two cultures within Black American experience, right? The 74%, the 76% marries the 24%. How does that mesh in a household? How do you raise kids in San Diego with parents coming from different perspectives on racial identity? Right. That's been a journey. And I think the Jack and Jill letter brought that out for me.
Jennifer?
That's really interesting. If I can jump in with a second there, do you think that class has something to do with different perceptions on Black identity? Well, I mean, there's actually a lot here. Like, I guess one more sentence, but like, I grew up in a pretty similar situation. Like, I grew up on the south side of Chicago. I was born on the south side of Chicago, which, as you guys know, is working to middle class, but very integrated. African Americans, Italians, Irishmen, who don't consider themselves white, by the way. Latinos were starting to move into the area at that time. Yeah. Moved to nearby East Aurora, Hispanic, Slavic guys. So, I mean, kind of the classic urban upbringing. And I'm relatively proud to be Black in the sense that I care at all. I'm not hostile toward it, but it was never a big deal. I mean, the few times I've been harassed by the police, it was for looking Hispanic with like the moderate skin, the bald head. It's a group that under-earns Black Americans, so you're definitely like, you're not at the bottom of the ladder in a lot of these environments. So I never really, cared much either, but I did notice that when I started entering the American upper middle class, a lot of the racial stuff seemed tied into class markers. So like the Divine Nine Black fraternities are very class linked. I mean, the Alphas are an elite future businessmen's group. Others are more, and they're all doing quite well, but others are more at sort of the preacher's daughter level. Like a lot of the Black race stuff seems very tied into your class and even skin color position in the Black community, which was something that with track teammates or playing basketball or something like that, I never thought about. So can you speak on that for a little? Like, what's the distinction between race and class and community feel that you had to pick up in the Black community?
That's a very good question. So where
all the rest of my questions will be stupid. I love it the first
Of course, that's right. Well, like I said, I really grew up outside of that bubble involving class as a marker of social status in Black America, just outside of it. I remember I write about this. The first time I ever heard the word Jack and Jill, my first girlfriend was flirting with me, and she asked me, well, what Jack and Jill chapter you belong to? It wasn't, do you belong to Jack and Jill? It was, well, what chapter do you belong to? There's the presumption, because I was heading towards Harvard Law School from UVA, that I must be in that small circle, that small class, if you will. And that was kind of my first introduction to Jack and Jill. It's interesting. People who are marked by the social indicators of class in Black America will. Yeah. It's not a one generation thing. These are multi-generational things. I mean, so my son's an Alpha Phi Alpha. His great-grandfather's an Alpha Phi Alpha because grandma said he had to follow the family tradition. My daughter is an Alpha Kappa Alpha because grandma, who's an Alpha Kappa Alpha, said you got to follow the tradition. And so is my wife, an Alpha Kappa Alpha. My grandmother-in-law was a Delta Sigma Theta. So those traditions go deep. And it's not just those institutions, Will, as I mentioned a little bit in the book. Those markers go all the way back to 1790. The Brown Fellowship Society, which was founded by my wife's ex-great-grandfather, was the first elite Black society in the country. And they only admitted 50 people, and you had to be of a certain skin tone, certain hair texture, and they did a lot of good things for the free Black community in Charleston, South Carolina. But that, I think, began the idea of social class in Black America from 1790 in Charleston, South Carolina, until 1920 when it went defunct. And a lot of people then moved to cities like New York and Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago. So yes, there's definitely a sense of social class, but people, it's multi-generational, so people don't even notice it. I guess that's it. Yes. As an outsider coming in, I can kind of like a writer observe all these weird rituals and customs and expectations over generations. It was news to me. And so I think in some ways, my wife once said, well, you're a wonderful husband. I just wish you were more Black. What she means by that is she wishes I was a member of Alpha Phi Alpha and the Boule and all the rest, and that I was an active Jack and Jill dad and all the rest. So in her, I'm a wonderful husband, wonderful dad, but I just am lacking that part in my structure, if you will, my makeup. But hey, my kids are Jack and Jill, so it's all good, right? Well,
I think a couple other people.
No. Go ahead. I interrupted you.
Okay. Yeah. No. Just one comment there. I think that's true for class structures in general. If you make it up through the class structure as just a smart working or middle class person, or something like a farm kid, all of that stuff. I mean, there's similar fraternity structures. Are you a skull or a pike on the white side? Most of my friends who were from those diverse sports teams actually went into integrated rather than Black fraternities, and that was a source of friction on both sides because so many were multiracial. Mom and dad. But I mean, all of that, even the whole thing that goes with college and grad school culture, like what an RA is. There's someone who's kind of a straw boss that manages your dorm. Like if you're from outside of that, you don't know any of that. You don't know the charities to give to, so on. And how much you choose to learn of that, I view a lot of it as pointless ritual nonsense and focus on making money. But I mean, like that is an important thing that you need to do in life. And I try to convey that to young male students at a state college now.
Yeah, good point. Very good point. I remember we once did a family road trip to the University of Arizona, and I was floored, Will. I was floored at how rapidly my mother-in-law was plugged into the local community in Tucson, Arizona. There were AKAs everywhere, Jack and Jill everywhere. So there really is an upper class milieu to these networks and connections. And, I talk a good game, Will, but, maybe I should be happy that my kids have access to those opportunities and networks. Maybe I should.
As long as they don't take them too seriously.
There you go.
Well, this isn't an answer to my favorite letter, but this goes to, Will, your question. One of the things in the book was, this is early on in the book when after I just finished this diversity training and I'm trying to be sensitive and trying to be compassionate and empathetic and all these whatever. And so I read Ta-Nehisi Coates, what was it? What the world between the world and the world.
Yeah, right.
And so I was, telling Wink, I was like, well, I don't know what it's like to grow up in the ghetto, so I can't have this conversation. And he writes back as, I don't know what it's like to grow up in the ghetto either.
That's true.
He's like, why did you assume I grew up in the ghetto?
Right. Why not assume I grew up in a Republican suburban county? That's my real life experience.
But so many of the books that you read now on race, there's a certain genre of the Ta-Nehisi Coates and whatnot that make an average middle-class person believe Blackness is oppression. Nothing else matters, as Wink's.
Yeah. Relative. So what does that do to suburban Black families when they read the national media and the national discourse? They don't see themselves reflected. So do they become alienated? Or do they parrot the party line to go along to get along? I have a theory on that. I think that some people just keep silent in the face of the national narrative. And then there are others who buy into it because it gives them a sense of social belonging, a sense of social connectedness. It reaffirms their Black identity. And there are people like me who refuse to let go of experiences in childhood that we know are real and authentic and genuine and that we cherish. That's the thing. It's very hard in all groups, but particularly in Black American society, to be a nonconformer, to be a dissident, to be an individual. But those who are, I think, are better off when they choose to be authentic to their lived experience, as opposed to aping and pretending that you're more urban and more down than the next guy. So it's interesting.
An example of what you're talking about, obviously people will fall in all sections, but we interviewed Jennifer Say recently, and having a corporate executive there, I was like, let me ask you some COVID, that kind of things, her story. I said, but hiring practice, things you had to go through over the years that you noticed. And we talked about DEI. And one of the points I made about why I have a problem with them there's many, but particularly to like affinity groups in the corporation. It's because I talked about how I saw this, and maybe Jennifer can think about how this relates to that training or other things as you see more coming from what your mindset was, and then after a few letters with Wink. But what I said was, it can't, and we'll agree like that these things don't work. But I said it's a lot of reasons why it may not work. One, that's not what the workplace is for. They don't have time to focus enough on it. But two things that stood out to me that were interesting is I watched these, they have these affinity groups, and they claim is to create a better, more rounded group within the company. Like all the employees will have a better understanding of what it's like to be Black or Asian or whatever. Not that you can do that in a couple of minutes, but beyond that, who ends up joining them, right? The Black affinity group is going to be joined by Black people. It's going to be chaired by an executive who might be white, but everybody in it is going to be Black. So it's not like everybody else is really learning anything because they're not invited. They feel like it's exclusive. But then the other thing to what Wink said, you asked, what do they do if their experience don't line up? And it was really a psychological experiment. I watched people, 9 or 10 people in the conference room, and they're like, what is it like? What are the problems? And then unfortunately it went to a Wink type first. So that person would be like, no, everything's good. My manager treats me well. I like it. It's great. And then other people are like, well, I think it's racist because they do this and they don't have enough of this. And then I watched that Wink person who wasn't as strong-willed as Wink is say, now that you mention it, I do have an example. And it's almost like they felt left out. So I had to come up with an excuse to fit in. Right. So that's what to be fair, I don't think that's what these things are intended to do. They have good intentions, but that's what it does. So to you, Jennifer, when I say think about that, I think that answers a bit of your concern, Wink, but also, did you see any of that? Or at the very least, can you see how you put a bunch of people in the room who's just trying to make a living and move up from middle management to executive? I just want to make it. And then you inundate them with videos and speakers who come in and tell them that they're a problem. What Coca-Cola, be a little less white. I actually had a coworker say that to me a couple of weeks ago, that somebody told him that, and he's like, I don't know what that means. So when you hear that, there's going to be a reaction. Now, a small percentage, they may get the reaction they want, but for a lot of people, they're either going to become more racist, or racist if they weren't, become, kind of like turn into themselves and stay away from each other, people, and stop being as outgoing as they were. They move up to management, and now they don't want to put any BIPOCs on the team because who knows what they're going to come up with. So what did you see about the reactions? Were people whispering, or what did you see?
You mean in the training itself? Well,
or just anyone you talked to after that?
Well, so with there again, remembering I went to hear different people's voices. It was a majority white session, but I had questions. So I was outspoken and would ask questions. And this one girl, white woman, she wrote a little note and passed it across to me and said, Black people are tired of talking about this. And I'm like,
so why have the training?
Well, that's what I was like, but I thought that's what we were there to do. That's the whole reason I signed up, was to like be able to ask questions and be like, what am I missing? Or, what was your experience? And so, she wrote this note, and on the note, she, like I said, she kind of passed it, across the desk, and she wrote books that I could read to educate myself.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of books, if I can ask, Jen? What kind of books?
Ta-Nehisi Coates.
There you go.
What do you mean?
Not taboo.
Robin DiAngelo.
Right,
the whole. So and then there was another time when we had to stand up with our white privilege scores, and you had to get in line, and we were instructed. It was very dramatic. We were instructed no one could speak, no speaking. Hold your number up, find your place in line, and scoot on in. And so we're standing in this line, and of course it looks the way you think it's going to look. But then you hear people you hear the sobbing, just this crying. And I was like, well, am I in the twilight? So what is going on?
Struggle sessions.
So
yes.
After that, people were standing up and apologizing for their white privilege. Again, this is mostly white people in the first place.
Did they give it away, or they just apologize for it? Because I don't want you to apologize for it and then keep it. What the hell?
Well, and so
I need you to renounce it.
Yeah,
I renounce my white privilege.
I can only remember apologies.
No renouncing.
But then I raised my hand again because I have more questions. I was there to learn. And I raised my hand and I asked something. Yeah, I wasn't appropriately apologetic. My question was more straightforward. And the rest of the time, I was a pariah. Like I was the untouchable. So talk about a caste system.
We were wiser in the 1970s in Southern suburban classrooms. I was the only Black kid in my class. And if people had these kind of trainings when I was that young, I would have been a goner. I would have been a basket case. I would not. I mean, the way to succeed in life, I think, is to have a strong internal locus of control as opposed to an external locus of control. And diversity training seems to be more about what do other people think about you and how can they mitigate their thoughts and prejudices, as opposed to, well, how do you view yourself and then how do you perceive the world and navigate it? That was always my approach in life.
And how you react to stuff. We're at a time where people deal with far less racism than they did in the past. No one can argue that that's not true. But at the same time, they seem to be far more upset about it when it does happen, and then they perceive it more often. So sometimes you can, because some things you're not really sure. You can take an action and you can take it as racist, or you can take it as not racist. You may be right, you may be wrong. But even if it is racist, do you have to get upset about it? I just had one today. It was funny. And I called one of my friends because I thought it was funny. But now, because I admit occasionally that the left has broken me now. So now I know, but not to the point that I think like them and it bothers me. But I see the way they see things that it makes me laugh. Like, man, if I was a leftist, I would be crying in my soup for the rest of the night because of this.
Oh, yeah.
So I get on the elevator. I'm in my building, the building I live in. And for those who don't know, I don't put on my personal business, but I'm an affluent Black man. So I get in my elevator, but I don't mention it unless it
Welcome
matters.
to Jack and Jill, just teasing.
Right. I don't mention it unless it matters. So I get in the elevator, and this nice woman, pleasant, gets in with me, an older white lady, and she's like, hi. I said, hi. It's so funny. She says, oh, what building? What apartment are you working in?
Oh, yeah. Right.
So obviously, right, the left would have been like, that they would be all over Twitter, that racist, whatever. But it's funny. So I thought it was funny. One. So, but here's the thing that's cool about it, because if she said that because a Black couldn't live in, that's racist, and that's true, and that's totally racist to why she said it, why would I let that ruin my day?
Right.
But here's the thing that's why you don't really know is because even to everybody here, you're probably like, well, she probably was racist, except I've never seen a Black tenant beside me.
Mm-hmm.
So unless you knew me, right, you would probably, I know that I saw that one Black guy here, haven't seen anybody else. So unless it's me, every other Black you see that come in here, it does work here, right? Or delivering or whatever the case may be.
Sure.
Is that racist if you've been there 15 years and you just see a Black guy you don't know and you assume that he's not working out? I don't know. Maybe it is. But it didn't ruin my day. I got a good chuckle out of it, though.
Right.
But that is something that people would go the rest of their day with a chip on their shoulder, yelling at people in the street because of that. What does that do for you? I mean, that person's gone on, didn't even realize they offended you.
You're giving your power to someone. You're giving your power to someone else, Charles. Right. You're giving some random white person power over your sense of self and your dignity and your mood for the day. Yeah. Once again, so much wisdom in attending school in the 1970s before a lot of this stuff. If people were prejudiced, that was on them, not on me.
Right.
My job was to do the best I could. You remember the story in the book? You may have come across it. I wanted to run for governor of my student council in junior high school.
Oh, yeah.
Political, right. So I was on the school bus home one day, and I told this classmate, I'm going to run for governor of student council. And he looked at me and said, who ever heard of a Black governor? And my response, he could pound sand for all I care, because I had my goals and I was going to do what I was going to do. That's my point, is that you kind of have to have a certain resilience and know what your goals are and not have your power removed by someone else's ignorance or nonsense. Yeah.
And these are jokes. Don't come looking for me. I'm not really affluent. Will, were you going to say something?
No, not at that moment. But I in terms of that last comment from Wink, I think just, I'm not doing too badly myself. I don't necessarily need to join any more organizations. No kids right now. But I do think that I'd like to hear more Black people, and perhaps especially Black men, say this. Like, yes, of course, racism is real. but I'm obviously quite successful in my business and my marriage. When I encounter racism, I treat it like my female friends do when they encounter sexism.
Right.
Or anything else. I mean, like I experienced substantially more discrimination when I was a member of the working class than I do now. So the idea that racism, we talked about this in our last show, actually. Charles might chip in here, but we had the Ratchet Republican, Benji Irby on here, and he asked a very intelligent question that almost never gets asked, which is, so people say I shouldn't vote for Trump because he's a racist and a crook. Why would that make me not vote for a politician? And it's so cynical, extremely logical. Like, why wouldn't you vote for the guy that'll lower your taxes, regardless of whether or not he's a racist and a crook? Who cares? But the assumption in the Black community has generally been that racism is a force as significant today as it perhaps was for our ancestors 100 years ago. It can barely be overcome. You should respond with anger, perhaps a physical fight, even as an adult man, if you're confronted with racism. And I don't really see that as how business women respond to sexism. I don't see that as how Asian Americans respond to racism. You, as an adult, you call your lawyer if it's serious enough, and if not, you just go on and get in the cab and go on to the next step of your day. So it's good to hear Wink outline that extremely well. I don't understand why this is such a rare attitude.
Yeah, it's true. There's a big law firm in Washington, D.C. called Hogan and Hartson. When I was in college, I read about this Black partner, Vincent Cohen. There were just two Black partners at Hogan. And he was asked by the reporter for the Washington Post, well, how do you handle racism in the workplace? Because there are only two Black partners at Hogan and Hartson. And he said, he was from Jamaica, by the way. He said, well, relevant. I treat it like the rain. I put up my umbrella and I just keep walking along. Yeah. Great story.
There you go.
Just put up your umbrella and keep walking along.
And it's worth noting, I mean, I've heard the name of the firm. I went to U of I Law in 2005. Okay. I mean, he's one of the most powerful lawyers in the country. I mean, like the idea that this man should be horribly confused by the fact that he had 5% more trouble than a friend getting a tea time or something. I mean, it's really bizarre. I mean, when you said it's like the idea of taking your power away, yes, it's the assumption that you are totally helpless until a friendly rival group decides to absolutely accommodate you in everything. That's an extremely bizarre attitude that I do not. I think it's very relevant that guy's West Indian, like from a successful Black country.
That's deep. That's deep. Yeah. Why is it relevant, Will, if I can ask? Why is that relevant?
Well, the most successful people in the country, I like saying this because I am pretty Black positive to the extent I think about this, but are Black immigrants. Asians make a bit more money, but I mean, Asians also on average are 10, 12 years older than the Black or even Southern white age curve, performance curve. But I mean, the best educated group in the country, Nigerians. A simple way to put this would be if you Google Wikipedia or Britannica, income by household, you'll see all the Black and all the white groups like clustered around the middle fighting with one another. So you'll have West Indians, Barbadians, Jamaicans, Nigerians, Ghanaians, and all those groups are a little behind like Englishmen, and you can tell they're a little irritated by it. Irishmen, they're a little hit of Irishmen probably, but everyone's kind of competing. And there are two outliers. One is ADOS Black people and one is Native American Indians. And that's deeply symbolic. I mean, you can attribute that either to lost wars a long time ago, or as I do, to some of the culture that came out of that, frankly, that still exists. I mean, you're not going to be successful in modern America if you live on a damn Indian reservation. You've got to move to a city and compete with everybody else. But I mean, I thought that's absolutely fascinating because if you're talking about racism, I mean, like to pick a country, Bermuda. I mean, the average income of a guy from that, first of all, the average income in the country is $70,000, just sort of no excuses. But the average income from an immigrant from the Abahian here is a little over that 80 or whatever it is. I could be off by a bit. Well educated. There's just not, there's nothing there. You're not going to experience less racism as a West Indian than as a Black American. You're basically going to be a dark-skinned, well-off Black guy from the islands who wears blue jeans.
Are you
like
saying
their national anthem is God Save the Queen? Like they're not exotic.
Are you saying a white supremacist who hates Black people isn't sophisticated enough to know which type Black person he should hate?
Well, this is, I mean, like my best friend from the islands is named John Goodluck. It's not like it's not quite the same thing as the ADOS Black experience in terms of the duration of slavery and so on. But I mean, they also lost the war in Africa bluntly. They just people who were enslaved in the islands simply went into a more Black-led, economically more integrated society where you had to do things like grow food for yourself. And that produced a different culture, a different society. not at all unusual in the islands in Jamaica, for example, to see whites and blacks together voting for a white or black leader, like Manley and his black VP.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when people from those societies come to the USA, without brutally critiquing the groups here in America, the assumption is just, well, okay, I'm a black man. That doesn't have much to do with the fact that I have to open this barbershop. So there's not the same agonized process of thought with this talk about post-traumatic slavery syndrome and all this other nonsense. They worked that out a couple hundred years ago, and now they're down there trying to attract tourists. It's a totally different attitude.
So I think that's a great example.
So Jennifer,
yes,
how did you take, because you went to this training because you wanted to learn more. You wrote the piece because you got nothing out of it. Then you start corresponding with Wink. But Wink is like me, so Wink had to basically slap you in the face at the beginning. You were like, I wanted truth, but I don't know if I was ready for this. I went from no truth to the stark truth right in my face. And I remember reading through it and how the letters progressed. And he was like challenging you in a sense, right? You're like, but I'm a good white person and I want to make things better for others. And he'd be kind of like, why the hell are you trying to make things better for me? No, that's not really what I meant. It's like, so, and then how you're like shocked, like just like he talked about Jack in jail, that's not his thing, but you would be like, what, they were affluent blacks? Right? So
glory be.
Right. So, talk about how you were challenged and how you grew, because he mentioned that he grew. So how you grew through this correspondence.
Sure. Well, I mean, let me start by saying I thought Jack and Jill was a nursery rhyme. Okay, I had no idea that it was. He had to.
No idea it was a bunch of uppity blacks who don't want to be around blacks. I gotta say, side note, we don't have enough time to get, because when he mentioned it too early, because I was waiting for this piece. But if you go listen to our radio interview from a year ago, I think Wink and I spent 20 minutes on, and I just decimated Jack and Jill. But I'm not gonna be that mean here. Can't stand it. But anyway, so you didn't even know that existed, and here there's this whole other world, right?
Yeah, it was absolutely fascinating to me. But it's interesting. You're right. Wink completely schooled me at the very beginning, but it was refreshing because I grew up. In my father was in the military. China. I grew up in Burma, Indonesia, China. The military is quite diverse, and so I always saw. I was often jealous even of people from, like, for lack of a better word, minorities or groups because I saw like a bond there in a community that like white people are just like all it's not the same kind of bond or community. And so I always saw also, particularly in Black America, but in the immigrant experience as well, this resiliency that I always really it gave me pride in America itself. And so when I came back to the United States, after living overseas, after being in that experience and kind of looking at the inside, from the outside in of America, and me having this kind of American dream and diversity and all this kind of good stuff, I was shocked by the polarization that I mentioned. And so I kind of fell into that. I tumbled into it accidentally, like, oh, well, I guess I've been wrong. Oh, I guess I've been, I'm a bad person. And so it was so I took that into the book. Wink, obviously, as you said, pushed back, but it was refreshing because I was like, oh my God, I thought I was going crazy because none of my Black friends before that had this syndrome or issue or and it was like new. And so I was like, maybe while living overseas I missed something. And so yeah, I learned. The other thing that I learned from Wink, though, I think the most important lesson that I learned from Wink of all the lessons is, and he's kind of expressed it in so many words already, is never engage bullies. I mean, because I'll be writing him and going, oh, something's happening on Twitter, and he's like, so who cares?
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
Well, you talked about your Black friends there when you were there, but like, I don't know if because you say they didn't really have that, which is kind of surprising. So are you saying that just when you were overseas, so when you came back here, was there a period, or maybe you didn't have meet a lot of people that you got close to, but you didn't see any of your successful Black friends or any of them kind of take on, like Wink said earlier, take on this not necessarily victimhood, but this anger, right? Because sometimes it's victimhood, but the people who are successful aren't really saying they're victims. They just feel they have a reason to be angry. So you didn't have friends or people in your circle who did that?
So most of my friends are, again, military that I grew up with, and so it's much like there's not that sense of needing anything, or not. That's not the right word. There's not this sense of lack. Mm-hmm. So most of my friends growing up that were different from me were also military, and so no, I honestly I didn't see that. I didn't see that change in people.
So you're lucky. That's good.
Yeah,
So
I guess
what about
so.
now? You wrote the books, you wrote the letters, you had these probably deeper conversations about race than anybody else. So now what? So now when you see the discourse, when you see Twitter, when you read articles or watch the news, what do you think about the discourse surrounding race, Jennifer?
I think what I thought when I went in, we are ripping. Wink saved me, saved my with the conversation, but I still think as I went in, we're ripping each other apart over these issues.
So it's Wink's fault because he's only saving one person at a time.
Yeah, well, hopefully
that's a good point. That's a good point.
Hopefully, that's why we end up saying
that's why they wrote the book, then.
That's why they wrote the book.
There you go.
That's right.
Other people can have these conversations. It is not exclusive to Wink and myself.
Right.
Sure. Well, the thing is, and we say it in the book, ideally, you would have over 40 million Black Americans have conversations with over 200 million white Americans. That's not possible. That can't happen. That level of engagement is just not going to happen. But one person can get to know another person deeply, and you can eliminate prejudice and bigotry to a large degree. It's a theory by, I think, Alport, the idea that the best way to reduce prejudice is when you engage with other people as equals. And so for me, once again, I give thanks that I grew up in a integrated, mostly white Southern suburb that was like middle America. Because as I came of age, I learned to see the individual first before the race, because everyone's different, right? It's kind of odd. If I had gone to an all Black school or a 90% Black school, and there were only one or two whites, it would have been easier to generalize and caricature people. But the fact that there were so many people who were white around me, I was able to and was forced to explore more into their individual psyches and psychology. So, for example, there's the jerk who says, "Who ever heard of a Black governor?" But there's Julie Hewitt, who's cheering me on with her yearbook salutation. There's my best friend from grade school, Terry Nicholson. There's my campaign manager. There are my colleagues in student council. So those positive images far outweigh the negative jerk, where I think for many Black students, because their settings are not sufficiently integrated, it's more easy for them to generalize and caricature white people. I'm thinking in particular of Ta-Nehisi Coates, who grew up in Baltimore. If I'm right, he didn't grow up in very well integrated schools. His schools in Baltimore were heavily Black. And so I think it's easier for him to generalize the other being white students, as opposed to me, who can more really easily see the individual in the person. That's just my theory.
Well, isn't it a part of it is probably the timing and the age? Because you talk about an interview you all did where you talked about growing up in an affluent neighborhood and having a Black real estate developer that lived across the street.
Yes.
And the guy's like, he looked at you like you had two heads, like that can't be right. He's checking his notes. That's not possible. He was colored. How could he own a house? Right. That was redlining. What do you mean he owned a house? Right. No, and I'm sorry, he didn't own a house. He owned many of them. That couldn't be right.
And that was stone cold. I don't want to insult the guy, but that was stone cold bigotry, right? That was stone cold prejudice.
Right, of course. But here's the thing. I would argue that you could have that, not even about the real estate developer.
Yeah.
But just about some of the norms of growing up or what happened to you. Like Clarence Thomas, listening to Clarence Thomas talk about his childhood, he's older than you. He grew up in Georgia. He's like, I had a great childhood. I love my childhood. Like you could, like people born after, unfortunately, too many born, and not even that young, like 80, but definitely after 1990, will say everybody was born before 1985 had a horrible life. And so I was talking about how Will and I I'm sorry, that Wink and I have a lot of similarities in the way we grew up, even though there are stark differences. The income was different. The makeup of the community was different. I grew up, now I always give credit. I was like, obviously we're lucky because Gary's different in the sense that it was all Black. So a lot of people like Will grew up, he was born in Southside Chicago. You grew up in a neighborhood that's majority Black in a big city that's not all Black. It's not really the same. And I used to think so, to be fair. It's different to grow up on the south side of Chicago in an all Black neighborhood and still shake your fist at the man downtown. I grew up in Gary where it was all Black. So the hobos and the drug dealers were Black, but so was the mayor, the police chief, and the doctor. So everybody was Black, right? So because to your point, you're talking about Ta-Nehisi Coates and what he grew up with. My school was integrated. Samika and I joked how I went from K through 12 and only went to school with one white kid in my class. There were a couple others in my whole grade all the way through.
Was he like the quarterback or something? Like, how do you wind up in that situation?
What's that? How did what?
Well, was he the quarterback or something? Like, how do you wind up in that situation?
It was funny though, Will, because
it was a girl.
It was a girl, and she got pregnant in her freshman year, and then she dropped out. So I never really knew her. I mean, there was a kid like 2 years behind me. I remember him. And there was 2 years before me, and one that graduated with my brother. So I remember like 4, but they were different years. But so like they were in different, junior high school when I was in high school and that kind of deal. But but only one in my grade the whole time. But at the same time, we still we weren't working class, but I knew I had friends whose parents were affluent, whose parents were whatever. So it's a little different. But my life, financially, how nice it was, maybe not as much, but the same. We went on vacations every summer. We went out of town. We didn't stay in town. We drove, but we still left. We weren't worried about the lights being on. We weren't getting picked on by bullies. No more so than normal fights, but it wasn't like this race thing and all this kind of stuff. People look at me like that's not even possible, right? Your life. I mean, you grew up. You're talking. This is the 70s and 80s. That's not possible. And I don't want to. I haven't mentioned this in a while, but I want to know what all of you think about this. I believe one of the problems. There are a lot of problems, obviously, surrounding race, but one of the biggest problems. Will and I, we always talk about the human condition. I talk about hubris, trying to fix it. We're smarter and more advanced than the people in the past, so we can fix everything.
Oh yeah.
But I think that we've reached about the level of racial integration and the minimizing racism as much as we could. Play with a year, 3 or 4 years either way, but I say somewhere around 2000. Right, you had plenty of Black shows on TV. You started to have Black characters on the white shows. People were listening. White kids were listening to hip hop. Run DMC had already done the thing with Aerosmith, so Black kids were listening to rock music. You had all the movies. I mean, I talked to a friend of mine. He's a couple years older than me. He went to college and he remembered going to the step shows. Right, so everything was cool. Right, it wasn't perfect, but it was good. And then somebody decided, well, we can tweak this a little bit more. And then they broke the dial off, and I'm like, how do we put this thing back on? And we went to because those people, right, who were in their 20s around that time, right? So they are somewhere between the high age 50, low end, 39 or 40. Those people look at these people in their 20s and they're like, they act like they got it bad. And I'm like, what do you mean, right? You all are offended about everything. You're emotional about everything. Well, we lived during all this time and we weren't complaining about all this stuff. So it was technically better. They had more advances than we had at our time. And yet everything was kind of foreign. So don't you think that it wasn't perfect, of course, but don't you think that was what do you think about my opinion that was about the best that we can get it? And as long as they mess with it, it's just going to go downhill from there. Will. You're on the younger end, so let's start with Will.
Go, Will.
Yeah, I mean, so I actually agree with that. I was in high school during that kind of Jordan Bird era when everyone kind of made fun of one another's sports teams, like white and Hispanic cats would usually cheer for the Celtics, Black guys for the Lakers. We'd all watch together. I mean, that's an image that sticks in my mind. I do think, in fact, I don't think, this is my next academic paper, race relations empirically were better then. Like one of the questions that Gallup asks every year is, what's your perception of race relations? And in 2000, maybe a little after Michael started the Iverson era, but I mean, in 2000, the perception among Blacks, 70% of African Americans thought race relations were good. And 68% of whites or something like that thought race relations were good. By the way, it's not surprising Blacks had a more positive view. To the limited extent there is interracial violence, so it tends to be more Black on white. But it was 70 and 65. I mean, it was extremely positive.
Way higher than it is now.
Those figures right now are, I think, 34 and 33%. Someone might correct by a point or two.
Crazy.
We've just empirically dropped. And the stuff with a lot of this social science, like we're not Kinsey anymore, walking up to people in bathrooms and asking them who they like to sleep with. Like the polls are pretty sophisticated, 100,000 people, this kind of thing. We know these figures and they're bad. They're half of what they used to be. And it's kind of what they're proposing is sort of more of the same as the medicine. Like, so obviously we haven't gone in hard enough on DEI. Right. We haven't attacked whites on racism and blacks on crime enough. We haven't done enough privilege walking out in the yard for all the white kids. We need more of it. And I mean, I think looking empirically at what happened when we didn't do any of this, like we were integrated, you were expected not to fight or bully. Right. I mean, if you were any sort of school participant, athlete, band member, something like that, there might be pretty significant consequences for you doing that. But that was the only rule. You could then you just interacted with everybody like they're everybody else.
Right.
Even the idea of making jokes that you could tease someone about being black or white or Latino.
Yep.
Right. That was extraordinarily common.
Right. Right, so but even like you say, not even just race, like LGBT. We had a period, the whole Stonewall. There was a reason for that. They would fire you for being gay. All that's true. Then there was gay bashing in the 80s. But that was the sweet spot where nobody cared, right? Where you could be gay, they might rib you and make fun of you. Ha ha ha! You kind of lighten the loafers. But Will and Grace was on TV. It was the time, and conservatives weren't complaining about it. They're like, I don't care. Have your TV
the 90s
show. But nobody was saying you had to have pride.
Yeah. Well, the 90s was the era when it became cool to be bisexual in high school, at least if you were a woman. Sometimes for dudes, if the school is upscale enough. But I remember my girlfriend telling me this at one point. It's not going to be an X-rated story, but it was like, just asked her, like, have you ever, quote unquote, been with a woman? And she said, well, no. And do you plan to be? I mean, I'd be interested in that. Well, no. What are you talking about? And it was just sort of like, well, what does this mean? Well, I think they're pretty. So do I. I mean, it was just, it became something that you wouldn't hide from, that you might advance in this period. And again, with LGBT acceptance, obviously some people just are gay. Some people are bi. But I mean, we've now seen a movement toward the expansion of that toward the ludicrous, where again, people are looking for something novel. I mean, the most popular, most rapidly growing sexual or gender identification right now is non-binary, quote unquote. So with all this stuff, I mean, when Charles said we turned the dial up to 11, like be unique, and then broke it off, I think that's fairly accurate. Like empirically, group relations are worse. Last line, Gordon Allport, who one of you guys cited earlier, said, Gordon Allport said the best way to fight prejudice is to have reasonably unbiased people interact as equals. So the examples that he's given were things like military trainings, sales meetings, where you know how exactly what everyone's performance is because it's written on a board, sports I'd throw in there. And that's how you get actual interracial friendships. I mean, in a situation where you're prohibited from making fun of any of the black kids, or where there's a 500-point boost given if you're Hispanic and you take the test, I mean, that's actually going to be very non-conducive to good race relations. And we're just sort of ignoring that right now.
Next?
Jen, I think.
Jen?
Where are we at right now, and what do we think is going to...
See, you forgot the question. No, I was saying, what are your thoughts on what I said about thinking that we had reached peak racial harmony in 2000 or so, and then they should have just stopped trying to fix it.
Yeah, I think I would agree, and a lot of it based on the numbers that Will already cited, and Will is the number cruncher. I mean, I've learned a lot from Will, your books, where you use numbers in a way that I don't think anyone else really does, and explains them in a way that no one else really does. But in a personal experience, I did not. I would say.
You weren't here. I wasn't in the country.
I wasn't in the country, but I was still interacting.
Americans were doing?
Well, there was Black Americans overseas too. It wasn't just white Americans. The conversation was not, I've never seen this conversation or this before in my life. And now I haven't lived all my life in America, but this is the worst I've seen it. And here's the thing. I think that we are segregating ourselves so much so that we aren't having these conversations like Wink and I. And the truth is, and Wink kind of touched on this earlier, it's kind of hard to hate people close up. And so, when Wink got to know, was forced to know these people as individuals and not as a group of white people or whatnot, he found a community and he found friendship. We are getting farther and farther away from that even being a possibility. I mean, we are interviewing people, Wink and I now, where there is this joy and this excitement about being in the all Black dorm, or this joy and excitement of being in Alpha Kappa Alpha. And so we are segregating more than we ever have, than I've ever seen. Mm-hmm. And it's and that's just a recipe for disaster, further disaster.
Well, I'm going to take an academic slant to your question. I think you're right, and I actually attribute the decline in the quality of race relations after 2000 to none other than the likes of Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw. Mm-hmm. Because I think those two law professors began to instill the idea that classical liberalism fell short, and that the way to really move up the dial was to engage in things that create a binary sense of the oppressed and the oppressor, and a structural analysis, systemic analysis to everything. Now, I may quickly add Richard Delgado to the august listing of Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw. But I think that those three and their colleagues in the academy began to promulgate ideas throughout legal education, which then went to education schools, which then filtered down to teachers in our public and private schools. And so I think in some ways, the root of the problem isn't that our characters, individuals, deteriorated over the past 20 years. I think it's the nature of the ideas and the words in which we describe reality that deteriorated over time. So I can look at my 1979 yearbook. I can remember conversations with my grandmother. I can remember my conversations with kids who were my classmates in college and law school in the 1980s. We didn't use words like oppression. We didn't use words like marginalized or intersectionality. I think those words are destined to lead us in the direction of more and more division and separation based upon race alone. And I don't know what the answer is. Well, actually, I have an idea, and I'll end. My idea, which I've written about, is that we really have to wait until a new generation is born, Charles. We have to wait until kids are born in the 2030s and 2040s who are going to rebel against the dogma of racial oppression, Blackness is oppression, nothing else matters, because kids always rebel against their elders. And when these kids are born and they recognize that there's this self-defeating, suffocating sense of identity, they're going to say, that's wrong. Who needs that? They're going to study their history books, and they're going to discover generations of Black people who were all about a higher aim in life in the 1870s, Reconstruction, or the 1930s at Howard Law School, or the 1970s, integrating Southern schools and suburban communities. And when those kids wake up, the ones born in the 2030s and 2040s, they're going to rip apart this dogma that creates division. And so that's why I kind of think beyond the year 2050, we're going to see a diminishment of this division, diminishment of collectivism in the public square, and a rebirth of the individual. That's my thinking.
Okay. And Jennifer, I'll let you tell everyone what you want them to take away from the book. You know, give them some good reason for picking one up. And
a good reason.
Yeah, a good reason.
A good reason?
Yes.
I mean, I think that what sets this apart from all the other books on race is it is actually, to our knowledge, you have never had a true, genuine conversation between two people of different melanin. We've decided to retire from race. So,
oh, welcome, Jennifer. I'm glad to hear that.
Yes. It took her a while. Huh?
Yes. Wink has so someone with different melanin, but no one has really done this before. And what I hope is that it's we also talk about life plainly, as Wink would say. And I think that that's maybe refreshing as well. We try to dispense with all of the dogma and the slogans, even though we talk about the slogans and the fact that we're dispensing with them. Yeah. But I think that I hope that people find that refreshing, and it gives them the courage to have that conversation and to stop segregating, but to actually come together in community over such conversations.
And Will, do you have any final question?
No, not really. I think we've gone through most of the questions I had.
Then Will, Wink, I'll give you too many W's here. Wink, I'll give you the final word. Wink, not Will.
I hope people buy the book for a simple reason. In these times of division and angst, we need to expand our knowledge. We need to expand our knowledge about each other beyond the artificial constraints of race. Because at the root, when all is said and done, at the end of the day, when your life is over, at your core, you are human. Your humanity is what remains, more so than surface traits like skin color. That's my take on things.
All right.
That's the book's take.
They are Jennifer Richmond and Winkfield Twyman Jr., authors of the new book, upcoming book, Letters in Black and White. When is it out?
May 23rd.
May 23rd. Pick up
2023. America, prepare.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Charles, for this lovely invitation. And thank you, Will, for your great questions. I got a country to save because I'm Patriot J and I'm saving a day.